What happens when a seasoned journalist refuses to play by the rules of royal protocol? You won't believe what unfolds when Meghan Markle sits down with George Stephanopoulos on Good Morning America, expecting softball questions and sympathetic nods, only to face the most brutal interrogation of her post-royal career. This isn't just another celebrity interview gone wrong. This is a masterclass in journalistic integrity meeting manufactured victimhood head-on, and the explosive confrontation that erupted live on national television will leave you speechless. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when two powerhouses clash in the most uncomfortable 7 minutes of morning television ever broadcast. The tension was palpable from the moment Meghan Markle stepped onto the GMA set. Dressed in her signature beige ensemble, a calculated choice designed to project both sophistication and approachability, she settled into the interview chair with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of public appearances. Her smile was camera-ready, her posture deliberately relaxed, and her hands positioned just so to display the subtle yet expensive jewelry that had become part of her carefully curated image. George Stephanopoulos, veteran of countless political battles and no stranger to interviewing controversial figures, sat across from her with his trademark intensity barely concealed beneath a professional exterior. The veteran journalist had done his homework, and unlike the fawning interviewers Meghan had grown accustomed to since leaving royal duties, Stephanopoulos came prepared with questions that cut straight to the heart of the controversies that had followed her like shadows. The opening pleasantries were textbook television: warm greetings, comments about her appearance, the usual setup that viewers expect before the real conversation begins. But even in these first moments, something felt different. Stephanopoulos' smile didn't quite reach his eyes, and Meghan's responses carried an undertone of weariness that suggested she sensed this wouldn't be the promotional platform she had anticipated. "Thank you for joining us this morning, Meghan," Stephanopoulos began, his voice carrying that particular cadence that experienced viewers recognize as the calm before the storm. "You've been quite active lately with your various projects and public statements. I think our viewers are curious about the disconnect between your calls for privacy and your continued presence in the media spotlight." The question landed with surgical precision, immediately putting Meghan on the defensive. Her practiced smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, barely noticeable to casual viewers, but glaringly obvious to anyone familiar with the subtle tells of someone caught off guard. "Well, George, I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding about what privacy means in this context," she replied, her voice taking on that measured tone that had become her signature during difficult conversations. "When we speak about privacy, we're talking about the right to control our own narrative, especially when it comes to protecting our children and our family's well-being." Stephanopoulos leaned forward slightly, a gesture that signaled he wasn't satisfied with the deflection. "But isn't there an inherent contradiction in seeking privacy while simultaneously engaging in high-profile interviews, documentary projects, and public appearances? You've given numerous interviews since stepping back from royal duties, each time discussing very personal family matters." The atmosphere in the studio began to shift perceptibly. Meghan's media training kicked in as she attempted to regain control of the narrative. But Stephanopoulos wasn't playing by the usual rules of celebrity interviews. This wasn't entertainment tonight or a friendly chat show. This was serious journalism, and he was treating her like any other public figure who had made controversial claims. "I think what people need to understand is that when you're constantly misrepresented in the media, when lies are being told about you and your family, you have a responsibility to set the record straight." Meghan responded, her voice beginning to carry an edge that hadn't been there moments before. "We didn't choose to engage with the media. We were forced to because of the continuous attacks and mischaracterize." The word "forced" seemed to hang in the air, and Stephanopoulos pounced on it with the instincts of a seasoned interviewer who had spent decades in Washington dealing with politicians who played fast and loose with the truth. "Forced is an interesting word choice," he said, his tone remaining professional but becoming noticeably sharper. "Because from the outside looking in, it appears that you and Harry have been quite strategic about your media engagements. The timing of your Oprah interview, for instance, came just as your father-in-law was dealing with health issues and your grandmother-in-law was in her final months. Some might say that timing was calculated to maximize impact while minimizing the family's ability to respond effectively. This was the moment when the interview shifted from uncomfortable to genuinely confrontational. Meghan's carefully constructed composure began to crack, and viewers could see the real person behind the polished public persona starting to emerge. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly in her hands, which had been resting casually in her lap, now gripped the arms of her chair. "I find it really disappointing that you would characterize our truth-telling as calculated," she replied, her voice rising slightly in both pitch and volume. "We waited years to tell our side of the story. We endured constant attacks, racist coverage, and deliberate attempts to undermine our work and our relationship. The idea that we should have remained silent while our reputations were being destroyed is frankly absurd." Stephanopoulos didn't back down. If anything, her defensive response seemed to energize him, as if he had found exactly the pressure point he was looking for. "But let's talk about some of these claims," he continued, pulling out a tablet that viewers could see contained detailed notes. "You've made several allegations over the years that have been disputed by other sources. The Archbishop of Canterbury, for instance, contradicted your claim about a secret wedding ceremony. Palace sources have disputed various other claims. How do you respond to critics who say you've been selective with the truth?" The question hit like a thunderbolt. Meghan's face flushed visibly, and for a moment, she seemed genuinely speechless. This was clearly not the direction she had expected the interview to take, and her discomfort was becoming increasingly obvious to everyone in the studio. "I'm sorry. Are you calling me a liar?" she asked, her voice now carrying an unmistakable tone of indignation. "Because if that's what you're suggesting, I think we need to be very clear about what's happening here." The studio fell silent, except for the barely audible hum of the cameras. Even the crew members seemed to sense that something significant was unfolding. Stephanopoulos maintained his professional demeanor, but there was a steel in his eyes that suggested he was prepared to take this confrontation as far as it needed to go. "I'm not calling you anything," he replied calmly. "I'm asking you to address the discrepancies between your public statements and the documented facts. That's what journalism is, asking difficult questions and seeking clarification when stories don't align with established facts." This response seemed to infuriate Meghan even more. She shifted in her chair, her body language becoming increasingly defensive as she prepared to launch what would become a blistering counterattack that would change the entire trajectory of the interview. But just as she opened her mouth to respond, something in Stephanopoulos' expression suggested that he had even more explosive questions waiting. And the real confrontation was only just beginning. The air in the studio crackled with tension as Meghan Markle straightened in her chair, her carefully maintained composure finally beginning to slip away completely. What had started as subtle discomfort had now transformed into something far more volatile, and everyone present could sense they were witnessing a moment that would be replayed and analyzed for years to come. "You know what, George?" Meghan began, her voice taking on a tone that was equal parts condescending and defensive. "I think what's really happening here is that you're perpetuating the same narrative that the British tabloids have been pushing for years. You're taking their word over mine, and frankly, I expected better from someone of your stature." Stephanopoulos remained unmoved by her attempt to flip the script. He had faced down presidents, prime ministers, and some of the most powerful figures in global politics. A deflection tactic from a former cable television actress wasn't going to derail his pursuit of the truth. "I'm not taking anyone's word," he replied with measured precision. "I'm presenting you with documented evidence and asking for your response. That's how journalism works. For instance, you claimed in your Oprah interview that you had surrendered your passport and driver's license upon joining the royal family and weren't allowed to leave the country. But we have photographic evidence of you traveling to New York for your baby shower, to Canada multiple times, and various other international trips during your time as a working royal. How do you reconcile these contradictory statements?" The question hit its target with devastating accuracy. Meghan's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment she appeared genuinely caught off guard. This wasn't the softball interview she had clearly expected, and Stephanopoulos' meticulous preparation was becoming increasingly evident with each passing minute. That's completely taken out of context," she stammered, her usual eloquence abandoning her in the face of specific documented evidence. What I meant was that there were restrictions, protocols that had to be followed. Every trip required approval, coordination with security teams, and adherence to strict guidelines that essentially made it impossible to have any genuine freedom of movement. Stephanopoulos consulted his tablet again, a gesture that seemed to make Meghan increasingly uncomfortable. She could clearly see that he had done extensive research, and her growing anxiety was becoming more obvious with each passing second. But that contradicts what other members of the royal family have said about their experiences, he continued relentlessly. Prince William and Catherine have spoken about their international travels, and their accounts suggest a very different level of autonomy than what you've described. Are you suggesting that you were treated differently than other members of the family? This line of questioning struck at the heart of one of Meghan's most serious allegations, and her response revealed the depth of her frustration with being held accountable for her claims. Of course, I was treated differently, she snapped, her voice rising noticeably as a carefully maintained public persona continued to crumble. Do you really think the first biracial American woman to marry into the British royal family was going to be treated the same as everyone else? The racism, the double standards, the deliberate attempts to undermine everything I tried to do. It was relentless and systematic. Stephanopoulos leaned back slightly, his expression suggesting he had been expecting this exact response and was prepared for what came next. Let's talk about those racism allegations specifically, he said, his tone becoming even more serious. You made very serious accusations about concerns regarding your son's skin color. But when pressed for details, you've been vague about who made these comments and in what context. Don't you think the public deserves more specificity when such serious accusations are being made? The question visibly rattled Meghan, who began shifting uncomfortably in her chair. Her media training had prepared her for many scenarios, but facing a journalist who refused to accept vague deflections and demanded concrete evidence was clearly not one of them. I protected the people involved by not naming them, she replied, her voice taking on a defensive edge that was becoming increasingly sharp. But the conversations happened, and they were deeply hurtful and concerning to both Harry and myself. Stephanopoulos wasn't satisfied with a non-answer and pressed forward with surgical precision. But without specifics, without context, without named sources, how can the public evaluate these claims? In journalism, we require verification, corroboration, evidence. You're asking people to take your word about extremely serious allegations without providing any means of verification. This challenge to her credibility seemed to push Meghan past a critical threshold. Her face flushed with anger, and her voice began to carry a tremor that suggested she was struggling to maintain control. Are you seriously questioning whether I experienced racism? She asked incredulously. Are you suggesting that I imagined the countless articles comparing me to my sister-in-law? The difference in coverage between us, the way every single thing I did was scrutinized and criticized, while similar actions by other family members were praised. Stephanopoulos remained calm in the face of a mounting agitation, his professional demeanor contrasting sharply with her increasingly emotional responses. I'm not questioning your experiences, he replied evenly. I'm questioning the specific claims you've made about specific incidents. There's a difference between experiencing unfair media coverage and alleging that members of the royal family made racist comments about your unborn child. Those are very different levels of accusation. The distinction seemed to infuriate Meghan even more, and her response revealed just how unprepared she was for this level of journalistic scrutiny. This is exactly what I'm talking about, she exclaimed, her voice now clearly audible to everyone in the studio. You're splitting hairs, minimizing my experiences, and essentially calling me a liar while hiding behind the pretense of journalistic integrity. This isn't journalism. This is harassment disguised as an interview. The accusation of harassment seemed to strike a nerve with Stephanopoulos, whose expression hardened perceptibly. He had spent decades building a reputation for fair but tough journalism, and having his professional integrity questioned by someone who had consistently avoided substantive scrutiny was clearly unacceptable to him. I'm asking the questions that need to be asked, he replied, his voice taking on a steelier quality. Questions that apparently no one else has been willing to ask. If you find accountability uncomfortable, That says more about your previous interview experiences than it does about my journalistic approach." This response seemed to be the final straw for Meghan, who was now visibly struggling to maintain any semblance of composure. Her hands were gripping the arms of her chair so tightly that her knuckles had turned white, and her breathing had become noticeably shallow and rapid. "Accountability," she repeated, her voice rising to a near shout. "This isn't accountability. This is a deliberate attempt to discredit me and invalidate my experiences. You've made up your mind before I even walked in here, and now you're just trying to tear me down piece by piece." The studio fell silent, except for the sound of cameras continuing to roll, capturing every moment of what was rapidly becoming one of the most explosive celebrity interviews in recent memory. Production assistants exchanged glances, clearly uncertain about whether to intervene or allow the confrontation to continue escalating. Stephanopoulos, sensing that he was on the verge of either a complete breakdown or dramatic exit, decided to push one step further with a question that would prove to be the point of no return. "Meghan," he said, his voice carrying the weight of years of investigative journalism, "let me ask you about something that our research team discovered while preparing for this interview. We found financial records showing that you and Harry received substantial payment from Netflix and Spotify before you officially stepped down from royal duties. How do you reconcile your claims about being cut off financially by the royal family with evidence that you were already securing lucrative entertainment deals while still working royals?" The question detonated like a bomb in the studio. Meghan's face went through a rapid succession of emotions: shock, panic, fury, and finally, a cold rage that seemed to consume everything else. Her carefully constructed public persona didn't just crack, it shattered completely, revealing something raw and desperate underneath. "How dare you?" she whispered, her voice trembling with barely contained fury. "How dare you sit there and act like you have any understanding of what we went through? You have no idea what it's like to be abandoned by an institution, to have your security stripped away, to be left to fend for yourself while the tabloids tear you apart daily." Stephanopoulos remained completely unmoved by her emotional outburst, consulting his notes with the dispassionate professionalism of someone who had weathered countless political storms. But the timeline doesn't support that narrative. He continued relentlessly. "According to these documents, initial discussions with streaming platforms began months before your official departure from royal duties. This suggests a level of planning and preparation that contradicts your claims about being suddenly cut off and left with no options." Meghan shot to her feet so abruptly that her chair rolled backwards several feet, the sound echoing through the suddenly silent studio. Her face was flushed with rage and her hands were trembling visibly as she struggled to process the fact that her carefully constructed narrative was being systematically dismantled on live television. "This is unbelievable," she said, her voice now carrying a sharp, almost hysterical edge. "You've ambushed me with selectively edited information taken completely out of context, and now you're trying to paint me as some kind of calculating opportunist. This isn't journalism. This is character assassination." The veteran journalist looked up from his notes with an expression that mixed professional satisfaction with genuine concern for what was unfolding before him. "These aren't edited documents, Meghan. These are public financial filings and contractual agreements. I'm simply asking you to explain the discrepancies between your public statements and the documented evidence." This response seemed to push Meghan past any remaining semblance of self-control. She began pacing behind her chair like a caged animal, her movements erratic and agitated as she struggled to formulate a response that could somehow salvage the situation. "You want to know the truth," she practically shouted, her voice echoing through the studio. "The truth is that we had to protect ourselves because nobody else would. We had to secure our future because the institution made it clear that we were expendable. Yes, we explored our options. Wouldn't you if your family was being systematically destroyed by lies and racism?" Stephanopoulos seized on this admission with the instincts of a seasoned investigator who had just heard a crucial piece of evidence. "So, you acknowledge that you were actively pursuing commercial opportunities while still claiming to be committed to royal duties," he pressed, his tone becoming increasingly pointed. "And you did this while publicly stating that you wanted to continue serving the Queen and the Commonwealth." The question struck at the heart of what many critics had long suspected. that Meghan's departure from royal life had been far more calculated and self-serving than her public statements had suggested. Her response revealed just how unprepared she was for this level of scrutiny. "You're twisting my words," she screamed, her composure now completely abandoned. "You're taking everything I say and turning it into something sinister. This is exactly why we had to leave, because people like you were determined to destroy us no matter what we did." The studio had become completely silent except for Meghan's increasingly frantic voice and the barely audible hum of the cameras capturing every moment of her meltdown. Production assistants stood frozen, uncertain whether to intervene or allow the confrontation to continue reaching its inevitable conclusion. Stephanopoulos, recognizing that he had pushed his subject to the breaking point, decided to deliver what would prove to be the final blow. "Meghan, you've built your entire post-royal brand on being a victim of institutional racism and family betrayal. But the evidence suggests a pattern of strategic decision-making, careful planning, and deliberate narrative construction that contradicts almost everything you've said publicly. How do you expect the American public to trust anything you say when the facts tell such a different story?" The question hung in the air like a death sentence. Meghan stopped pacing and turned to face Stephanopoulos directly, her face a mask of pure rage and wounded pride. For a moment, it seemed like she might launch into another defensive tirade, but instead something seemed to break inside her. "I'm done," she said quietly, her voice suddenly flat and emotionless. "I'm absolutely done with this charade." She moved toward her chair as if to sit back down, but instead, she grabbed her purse with such violence that several items spilled onto the floor. Her movements were sharp and erratic as she struggled with a microphone clipped to her jacket, her hand shaking so badly that she couldn't manage the simple task of removing it properly. "This entire interview has been a setup from the beginning," she declared, her voice rising again as she finally freed herself from the microphone and let it drop to the floor with a sharp crack. "You had no intention of having an honest conversation. You just wanted to humiliate me on live television." Stephanopoulos remained seated, watching her melt down with the detached professionalism of someone who had seen similar scenes play out in political interviews countless times before. "I wanted honest answers to legitimate questions," he replied calmly. "If you find that humiliating, that's not a reflection of my intentions. It's a reflection of the contradictions in your own statements." This final response seemed to be more than Meghan could bear. She straightened to her full height, fixed Stephanopoulos with a look of pure hatred, and delivered what would become the most quoted line from the entire interview. "You know what, George? You can take your legitimate questions and your documented evidence and shove them where the sun doesn't shine. I don't have to sit here and listen to this garbage from someone who's clearly been bought and paid for by the same people who've been trying to destroy me for years." The accusation that he had been bought and paid for seemed to genuinely surprise Stephanopoulos, who raised his eyebrows slightly, but maintained his professional composure even in the face of such a serious allegation. "That's a very serious accusation, Meghan. Do you have any evidence to support that claim? Or is this another example of making statements you can't substantiate?" The question was the final straw. Meghan let out a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a scream, gathered up the remaining contents of a purse that had scattered across the floor, and headed toward the studio exit with such determination that several production assistants had to quickly move out of her way. "Find yourself another victim for your hit job," she called over her shoulder as she strode toward the door. "I'm done being your entertainment for the morning." As she reached the studio door, she turned back one final time, her face still flushed with rage and her voice carrying across the silent studio with crystal clarity. "And for the record, everything I said about that family and that institution is true. The fact that you'd rather believe a bunch of palace bureaucrats and racist tabloid journalists over a woman who lived through it says everything anyone needs to know about who you really are." With that final declaration, Meghan Markle pushed through the studio doors and disappeared from view, leaving behind a stunned silence that seemed to stretch on forever. The cameras continued rolling, capturing Stephanopoulos as he sat alone at the interview desk, his expression mixing professional satisfaction with genuine amazement at what had just transpired. After several long seconds, he turned directly to the camera and delivered what would become the interview's most memorable moment. "Well," he said with characteristic understatement, "that certainly wasn't the conversation we were expecting to have this morning." We'll be right back after these messages. As the show cut to commercial, the studio erupted into a buzz of excited conversation among crew members who knew they had just witnessed television history. The interview that was supposed to rehabilitate Meghan Markle's public image had instead become a masterclass in how quickly a carefully constructed narrative could collapse under the weight of actual journalism. The confrontation was over, but its impact would reverberate through the media landscape for months to come, serving as a stark reminder that even the most polished public figures couldn't escape accountability when faced with a journalist who refused to play by their rules.